Max had always been loyal. He had been there for every car ride, every family gathering, every quiet moment at home. But as the door closed behind him that day, he had no idea that it would be the last time he'd see them. The street was empty. The sounds of his family's laughter faded with every step they took away from him. He waited, patiently. He sat by the door, wagging his tail, expecting them to come back and scoop him up like they always did. But hours turned into days, and Max realized they weren't coming back. What he didn't know was that his family wasn't just gone, they were replacing him. And when he saw them again, just a few days later, something inside him shattered. They brought a new puppy home. Max, confused and hurt, wagged his tail, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had come back for him. But instead of calling his name, the door slammed shut in his face. Max had given them everything, and this was how they repaid him. But what happened next? It will break your heart and restore your faith in second chances. Max had always been a part of the family. From the moment his paws first touched the warm floor of their home, he became more than just a pet. He was family. His fur was soft and golden, his eyes full of love and loyalty. He would wait by the door every morning, tail wagging as his owners prepared for the day. He loved being around them, whether it was lounging on the couch while the family watched TV, running through the backyard in the afternoon sun, or lying at their feet, simply enjoying the sound of their voices. Max's family loved him just as much. They were always smiling when he did something silly, laughing when he would roll onto his back in a full-on belly rub session. He never had to wonder if they cared. He could feel it in every stroke, every kind word, every treat they handed him. Then one day, something changed. It wasn't like the other days when they'd leave for work or run errands. This time, there was a strange heaviness in the air. Max could sense it, but he couldn't understand why. He followed them around the house, watching as they packed up things. Bags, clothes, boxes. Everything seemed to be going into the car, but they didn't look at him like they usually did. Max stood by the door, tail wagging, waiting for them to tell him to jump into the back of the car, like he always did when they went on family trips. But they didn't even call him. It wasn't long before the car started moving. Max's paws left behind a trail of dust on the floor as he ran to the front yard, eyes locked on the car pulling out of the driveway. But this time was different. This time, they didn't turn around. He didn't know how long he stood there, but by the time he turned back toward the house, the car was gone. The evening light faded, and Max lay on the doorstep, waiting. They would come back for him. He knew it. He had always been part of the family. Why wouldn't they return? But as night stretched into morning, Max's hope began to dim. They never came back. At first, he thought they must be delayed. Maybe something had happened. But days passed. The food he had been given was gone, and no one returned to refill his bowl. His once comfortable bed by the fireplace remained cold. Max couldn't comprehend it. Every time he ran to the door, his heart skipped, hoping to hear the familiar sound of his owner's voice calling his name. But the house remained silent. Max began to roam the neighborhood, looking for anything familiar, anything that would lead him back to his family. He didn't know where they had gone, or why. His paws ached as he wandered through empty streets, but there was no sign of them. Days turned to weeks, and Max grew thinner. The weight of abandonment began to settle on his shoulders. But even then, he couldn't give up. Max continued to return to the house where he had once been loved, waiting by the door, hoping that they would finally come back for him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw them again. He was waiting at the same spot, on the same porch where they'd left him. The door creaked open, and there they were, his family. But this time, they weren't alone. They carried a small, playful puppy in their arms. Max froze. He didn't understand. His tail wagged instinctively. Maybe they'd come back for him. Maybe this puppy was just a new friend they'd bring into the fold. But when they stepped through the door, they didn't call him. Instead, they closed the door behind them, leaving him outside. The confusion, the pain, the betrayal, It all hit him in that moment. Why? Why had they left him behind? It was an ordinary morning, or at least Max thought it was. The kind of morning that felt just like any other. Sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, the birds chirping outside, and the smell of breakfast in the air. But there was something different today. Max had been lying in his usual spot by the front door, enjoying the warmth of the sun on his fur, when he heard the sound of footsteps. His ears perked up. He wagged his tail in excitement, anticipating the familiar routine of a busy morning. His owner, Sarah, would come down the stairs and he'd give her a nudge with his nose. She would laugh, pat his head, and give him a treat before leaving for work. It was a simple routine, but it was his routine, and Max loved it. But today, it didn't happen. Instead of Sarah coming down the stairs, he heard the sound of luggage being wheeled through the hallway. He could hear the clink of keys, the rustle of clothes being stuffed into bags. It was the sound of preparation. Max's tail wagged faster. It was an exciting time. Family trips were always the best. He could almost imagine himself jumping into the back seat of the car, feeling the wind whip through his fur as they drove down the highway to their destination. His paws were already ready to follow them to the car, ready to go on another adventure with the people he loved. But as the sounds of the family packing continued, Max grew more and more confused. His owners, Sarah and her husband Tom, were moving around the house in a rush, not speaking to him, not acknowledging him. It was as though he didn't exist at all. They were leaving, but they weren't calling for him. Max stood up from his bed, his legs stiff from lying too long, and padded to the door. He pressed his nose against the cool wood, his ears straining to hear. Surely they hadn't forgotten him. He scratched at the door once, just the way he always did when it was time for their walk. But no one came. Max's heart started to race. Why weren't they calling him? He waited for what felt like an eternity, watching through the narrow crack between the door and the frame. But still, nothing. No gentle hand reaching down to open the door, no voice calling out, "Come on, Max, let's go." Sarah walked past him, her face pale, her eyes avoiding his. Max gave a soft whine, his nose pressed against the door, his eyes filled with confusion. This wasn't right. Max had seen them leave before, but it was always for a short while. They would come back, and everything would return to normal. But today felt different. Hours passed. The house became eerily quiet, save for the sounds of Max pacing back and forth in the living room. His eyes were always glued to the window, waiting for them to return. But all he saw was the empty street, the wind blowing the autumn leaves across the sidewalk. He tried not to panic, reminding himself that Sarah and Tom would be back soon. They had to be. They wouldn't leave him. By nightfall, Max's stomach growled, but he barely noticed. He had grown used to the routine of his family's comings and goings. They always left food out for him, and he had learned to be patient. The food was there, waiting for him in his bowl, but his mind was too consumed by confusion to eat. Max lay on the floor, resting his head on his paws. His eyes never left the front door, waiting for it to swing open and for Sarah to walk through. But the door remained locked, and the house remained still. As the hours wore on, Max's hope began to fade. The familiar smells of dinner didn't come. The sounds of laughter and the soft clink of dishes didn't fill the air. It was too quiet. Max stood and trotted to the window again, looking out into the cold evening. The streetlights flickered to life one by one as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. He could see the faint outline of the car in the driveway. Empty, just like everything else in the house. The night stretched on, and Max's body began to ache with exhaustion. His legs were tired from pacing, his mind weary from the uncertainty. But still, he refused to give up. They would come back. They always did. The next morning, when the first light of day broke through the blinds, Max was already at the door, waiting. He could hear the faint hum of cars on the street and the distant sound of birds in the trees, but the house was still, silent, and empty. Max tried to comfort himself with the thought that maybe they had just gone for a short trip. But the day stretched into another, and then another. Days passed, and still there was no sign of Sarah, Tom, or the familiar sounds of their lives. Max continued to wait. But the truth was becoming clearer and clearer. They weren't coming back. Days turned into weeks, and still, Max found himself standing at the edge of the yard where he used to play, waiting for the door to open, for Sarah or Tom to call him back inside. But the door never opened, and the house, once full of warmth and love, was now just an empty shell. Max couldn't understand. Why? Why had they abandoned him? The first night without them had been the hardest. He had tried to curl up on the cold, bare porch, the same spot where he used to sit and watch for their return. But the cold was unbearable. The chill in the air bit at his skin, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the house as if mocking his solitude. Max didn't know what to do. He padded around the yard, sniffing the ground, looking for any trace of them, but everything was quiet. He sniffed the door, hoping for some sign that they had only gone out for a short time, that he had somehow missed them. But there was nothing, just the faint scent of furniture polish and old memories. The familiar smells of his family had already begun to fade. By the third day, hunger had set in. Max's food bowl, once filled with his favorite kibble, was now empty. The warm meals he'd grown used to were no longer waiting for him. His stomach growled in protest, and his paws began to feel raw from pacing up and down the driveway. With no other choice, Max wandered the streets, searching for anything he could scavenge. The first few days were bearable. He found scraps of food left behind by people passing by, a piece of bread here, a half-eaten sandwich there. The city was busy, and Max was used to being around people. He had often greeted neighbors with a friendly wag of his tail, but now he didn't approach anyone. He was a stray now, and he couldn't afford to trust strangers. His heart ached with the loneliness, but he couldn't allow himself to be weak. Survival was everything. But the nights were brutal. Max found shelter under a rusty metal awning behind an old grocery store. The cold concrete pressed against his belly, but at least it was out of the wind. The ground was hard and unforgiving, but it was better than nothing. When the wind blew through the alley, he curled up tightly, trying to keep warm with what little fur he had left. He missed the warmth of his bed. The soft carpet, the fireplace crackling in the living room, the steady rhythm of Sarah's and Tom's footsteps around him. Those things were gone now, replaced by the cold emptiness of the streets. But he didn't know how to let go. Every day, without fail, Max returned to the house. He would sit on the porch and wait, tail wagging, looking at the windows, hoping for the sound of the door opening. But it never came. The house remained quiet and still, as if it had been abandoned long before Max had arrived. The cold, hard truth started to settle into his bones, but his heart refused to accept it. Why wasn't he allowed back inside? Max didn't understand. He had been loyal. He had been there through thick and thin, always ready for the next adventure, the next walk, the next game of fetch. He had never asked for anything more than love, and yet now he was treated like a ghost, unwanted and forgotten. But still, he returned. Every morning he stood in front of the house, staring up at the windows, hoping, wishing, praying that he would see Sarah's face, that she would open the door and call out to him. His heart would leap in his chest every time a car passed, thinking that maybe it was their car, that they had come to take him home, but each time they would drive past, leaving him alone once again. The days blurred together. The food scraps became scarcer, and Max's strength began to fade. He was no longer the happy, energetic dog that had once run around the backyard, chasing after tennis balls and playing in the sunshine. Now he was a shadow of his former self, thinner, weaker, and more desperate than ever. His fur, once shiny and healthy, had grown dull and matted. His ribs began to show, and his paws were covered in dirt and grime from wandering the streets. Still, Max refused to leave. He couldn't. The house was all he had left. One day, while scavenging in a nearby alley, Max came across a small group of stray dogs. They were huddled together for warmth, their eyes wary as Max approached. He had seen other dogs in the streets before, but they never paid him much attention. This time, though, they seemed different. One of the dogs, an old, scruffy terrier, eyed him carefully before barking sharply. Max froze, unsure of what to do, but instead of attacking, the dog stepped back, allowing him to join the group. For the first time in weeks, Max felt the warmth of companionship. He lay down beside them, sharing their body heat as they all dozed off, the sounds of the city slowly lulling him to sleep. Max's thoughts were cloudy, but he couldn't shake the memory of his family. The warm house, the sound of their voices, the days he had spent as part of a family, not just a stray dog fighting for survival. His stomach growled again, but this time he didn't feel the same sharp pang of hunger. Instead, he looked around at the other strays, realizing that he wasn't completely alone. But Max still couldn't help but return to that one place, that one house. Every morning he would trek back to the porch, sit by the door, and wait. The house had become his prison, and no matter how much it hurt, he couldn't tear himself away from it. The question remained, unanswered and persistent. Why wasn't he allowed back inside? The loneliness was unbearable, but Max continued to hold on to hope, because no matter how much he suffered, the memory of his family, of their love, kept him anchored. And somehow, deep down, he believed they would come for him. Max had grown used to the routine of wandering the streets, his heart always tethered to the house at the end of the block. Every morning, he woke to the familiar sight of the empty porch where he had once rested. The house that had once been full of life, laughter, and warmth now felt like an eerie monument to his loneliness. Still, Max couldn't help himself. Every day he returned to the same spot, sitting quietly, tail thumping against the cold wood of the porch, waiting for something he no longer believed would come. Then, one day, he saw them. It wasn't a car he recognized at first, but as it pulled into the driveway, Max felt his heart leap in his chest. Sarah. Tom. The sound of the car door slamming, the soft murmur of voices. He could feel it. They were back. The familiar scent of their cologne, the soft rustling of their clothes as they moved about, he had never been able to mistake it. Max stood up, his tail starting to wag despite the deep ache in his body. His heart raced, his body trembling with anticipation. After all this time, they had come back for him. Maybe this time, they wouldn't leave him behind. He padded closer, ears perked up, eyes shining with hope. It had to be them. It just had to be. Max had never stopped believing that somehow, one day, they would return. Today felt different. Today felt like the day everything would go back to normal. Then the door opened. Max's heart skipped a beat. The familiar creak of the door, the scent of Sarah's perfume mixing with the cold air, it was all too much for him. They were here. But then something stopped him. He saw them walk through the door, but they weren't alone. A small puppy, no older than a few months, bounded across the porch, wagging its tail happily, its tiny legs barely keeping up with Sarah's strides. The puppy was adorable, its soft coat of fur and bright, innocent eyes, but it wasn't Max's puppy. It wasn't his family anymore. Max stood frozen in the middle of the yard, the sight before him striking like a blow to the chest. His tail that had been wagging happily slowed to a stop, and his heart, once full of hope, sank into his stomach. No, no, no. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They weren't supposed to bring home a new dog. He was their dog. For a long moment, Max just stared at the puppy, his body rigid, his eyes wide. The puppy was running around in circles, its small paws kicking up the snow. It was everything Max once was, young, playful, and full of energy. But it wasn't him. It was a new addition to the family, a replacement. Max's legs shook. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the unbearable sadness sweeping through him like a cold wind. His tail, once wagging so desperately, now hung limply between his legs. The joy he had felt only moments before vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by the stinging pain of betrayal. He wanted to turn away. He wanted to run, to find somewhere, anywhere, that didn't remind him of this unbearable truth, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen. All he could do was watch as Sarah and Tom interacted with the puppy, laughing, their voices warm and full of affection as they showered the tiny dog with attention. They didn't even look at Max. And then it happened. Max, heart in his throat, stood there and wagged his tail again almost reflexively as if by sheer instinct. He couldn't help it. He wanted to be noticed. Maybe, just maybe, if they saw him, if they really saw him, they would remember. They would realize they had left him behind and come back to take him home. But they didn't see him. Instead, Sarah walked over to the door, the puppy bounding at her feet, and without even glancing in Max's direction, she shut the door behind her. The sound of the door clicking shut was like a hammer smashing the last remnants of Max's hope. Max stood there, his tail still hanging between his legs, the wags slowing to a halt. His body trembled as the weight of it all finally hit him. They had moved on. They had replaced him with a new dog, a new companion to love and care for. The space he had once occupied in their lives was no longer his. Max was no longer part of their family. He was just a memory, something they had left behind. Max's body slumped. His shoulders sagged as if all the weight of the world had suddenly fallen on him. The pain was unbearable. It felt like someone had ripped out his heart and left him there, exposed and alone. He turned slowly, his paws dragging along the cold pavement as he made his way back toward the street. The world felt empty. The once familiar streets now cold and indifferent. The city, the people, everything around him felt so distant now. Max had spent so long searching for answers, so long holding on to the belief that his family would return. But in that moment, he knew the truth. They had moved on, and he had been left behind. As he walked away from the house that had once been home, Max felt a deep ache in his chest, the sting of betrayal a constant companion. But something else, something even deeper, had started to creep in. The realization that he had to move on, too. Max could no longer hold on to a past that no longer existed. He had to find a new path. He had to survive, even if it meant letting go of the family he had loved with all his heart. And so, Max walked away from the only home he had ever known, knowing that some scars take a lifetime to heal. The days blended together. Max's fur, once a rich shade of golden brown, had dulled and tangled from lack of care. His ribs pressed against his side, a constant reminder of the days he spent without food. His paws, now raw from endless walking, ached with every step he took. The streets felt colder now, not just because of the winter chill, but because the hope that had once kept him going had slowly begun to fade. Max was hungry. Starving, really. The scraps he had found in the alleyways had become increasingly rare, and he had grown weaker with each passing day. His stomach churned, and his body felt like it was slowly betraying him. Yet still, despite all the pain, he couldn't bring himself to leave the house. Max had spent so many nights lying on the porch waiting for the door to open. But every time, the same thing happened. The door would close, and the family would go on with their new life, leaving him outside, a stranger to them. The puppy, their new companion, would be curled up on the warm carpet, while Max shivered on the cold concrete. His mind began to spiral, torn between two competing thoughts. The hunger gnawing at him urged him to move on, to leave this place and find somewhere else to survive. It would be easier that way. He could stop this relentless waiting, stop this futile hope. Maybe there was a shelter somewhere, or even another family that would take him in. But each time Max tried to push away the memory of Sarah and Tom, he felt an unbearable ache in his chest. Could he give up on them? Max had always been loyal. He had never stopped believing that his family would come back for him. But every day that belief grew weaker. His stomach growled again, and he slumped against the porch steps, exhaustion weighing him down. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, and his body begged him to rest, to give in. He closed his eyes for a moment, hoping for some relief, but all he could hear was the memory of their voices, the laughter, the calls to him as he ran across the yard, the warmth of their touch. It was like a distant dream now, a life that seemed impossible to return to. Max let out a low whine, his chest tightening. What was he holding on to? What was left for him here? Hunger was making him delirious, and the loneliness was becoming unbearable. He had been pushed to the brink, his body physically exhausted, and his heart broken in a way that seemed too painful to bear. The moment had come when he needed to make a choice. Should he leave? Should he finally walk away and stop hoping? The future seemed uncertain, but at least it was something. The streets might be cruel, but they weren't this kind of cruel. Max's paws trembled as he pushed himself up, his legs weak. His stomach screamed in protest, but he couldn't stay here any longer. It was too painful. His family had moved on, and the dog they had chosen over him was now occupying the space that had once been his. His old life was gone, and with it, his place in their hearts. Max took a tentative step away from the porch, his gaze lingering one last time on the house. He walked slowly, dragging his feet, feeling the weight of the decision settle heavily on him. His body screamed for food, for rest, for something to keep him going, but his heart felt empty. He had lost everything, and now he was walking away from the last bit of hope he had left. Just as he reached the end of the driveway, something caught his eye. A familiar sound, a car door opening. Max froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It couldn't be. But it was Sarah, Tom. They were standing by the car, smiling. The puppy, now a little older, was prancing around them, happy and oblivious. Max's heart pounded in his chest. Was this it? Was this his chance? Had they come for him? Or was he simply imagining it all? He couldn't stop himself. He moved forward, his legs shaky, his body pleading for the strength to keep going. His heart was already in his throat as he approached the gate. He had to know. He had to see if they would remember him, if they would see him standing there, waiting, just like he always had. As he drew closer, Sarah caught sight of him. For a split second, Max saw her face falter, a look of recognition. She stopped, her smile fading, replaced with a mixture of confusion and guilt. Tom, noticing her change in expression, turned to follow her gaze. He saw Max standing there, ragged and thin, his eyes wide with hope. But then, instead of rushing to him, instead of calling his name, Sarah turned away. She bent down to pick up the puppy, cuddling it close to her chest, as if Max wasn't even there. The door was already half closed before Max could take another step. Max's world shattered. The door clicked shut. It was the same moment that his heart shattered into pieces. His body froze, and for a long time he just stood there, staring at the door that had once been his portal to love and comfort. There would be no reunion. There would be no more waiting. He turned around, pain throbbing in his chest. But as he did, something unexpected happened. A voice. "Hey, boy." Max's head snapped up. He wasn't sure he had heard it at first, but then he saw a man standing by the gate. He was older, with graying hair and a kind smile and a gentle hand outstretched toward him. Max froze again, unsure of what to do. Was this some kind of trick? Another stranger offering pity? But the man's expression was different. He wasn't offering food or shelter out of guilt. He was offering it out of something Max hadn't felt in so long. Kindness. The man crouched down to Max's level, his eyes soft and sincere. "It's okay, boy," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You're not alone anymore." Max's legs felt weak, but somehow he found the strength to approach. Slowly at first, cautiously. He sniffed the man's outstretched hand, unsure, but then something inside him broke through. He nudged the man's palm with his nose, his tail hesitating before it began to wag. In that moment, Max realized something. He wasn't done. The love he had given, the loyalty he had shown, didn't have to end with the family that left him behind. He still had love to give. And maybe, just maybe, this man would be the one to see it. Max had made his choice. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't leave. He would find a new home, a new life, and, for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that love might find him again. Max stood still, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he looked at the man crouching in front of him. The stranger's face was kind, with wrinkles that spoke of a life well lived, eyes that seemed to understand more than they let on. The man's outstretched hand didn't tremble with pity or hesitation. It was steady, warm, and full of sincerity. It was the kind of hand that could give comfort to a broken heart, but Max wasn't sure if he was ready to trust again. For so long, he had been alone. He had been abandoned by the people he thought would always take care of him. How could he trust anyone again? His tail, which had once wagged so freely in the warmth of his family's love, now hung limply between his legs. The small, hopeful part of him that had longed for affection felt exhausted. The idea of letting someone close again seemed too risky, too painful. Max looked at the hand, then back at the man's face. The stranger was still crouched down, not forcing anything, not reaching forward to grab him, but simply waiting. He wasn't making demands. He wasn't asking for anything. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet filled with a warmth that Max hadn't felt in so long. "It's okay, boy," the man said, his voice like a balm to Max's battered soul. "I'm not going to hurt you." Max's instincts told him to back away, to retreat into the shadows where it felt safer, where he didn't have to risk getting hurt again. But as he stood there, staring at the man, he realized something. He wasn't in danger. The man hadn't moved closer. He hadn't tried to grab him, to force him into anything. There was no urgency in his movements, no quick, jerky motions that would make Max nervous. He was simply offering his presence, offering kindness. Max had seen this kind of behavior before, but it had always been accompanied by disappointment. People were kind for a moment, but then they would pull away, leaving him behind. He had experienced kindness before, from his family, the family that had left him. His mind screamed to protect himself, to shut down the longing that swelled in his chest. But the silence between him and the stranger spoke volumes. For a long while, they just stood there. The man didn't try to coax Max into anything. He didn't speak any more words. His eyes just held Max's gaze, as though waiting for the dog to decide, waiting for Max to make the choice. Max's stomach rumbled and he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The hunger had been gnawing at him for so long that he wasn't sure if he could take another step without collapsing. His body was aching, but somehow he still couldn't take his eyes off the man. Why wasn't he turning away? Why wasn't he walking off, leaving Max to his fate? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. But slowly, Max took a step forward. The small, hesitant movement felt like the world's heaviest burden, but something inside him was pulling him toward the stranger. It wasn't desperation, it wasn't even need. It was something deeper, something raw that he hadn't felt in so long, a flicker of hope. Max took another step, then another. The man's hand was still outstretched and his posture was open, unthreatening. He never took his eyes off Max, as though silently reassuring him that he wasn't going anywhere. Max sniffed the air, taking in the stranger's scent, lingering over it. It wasn't familiar, but there was something about it that didn't scare him. It was warm, like the smell of clean earth after a rainstorm. It was the scent of comfort. Max's paws moved, almost on their own, as though some invisible force was guiding him toward the stranger. He slowly reached the man's outstretched hand, sniffing it first, unsure. The stranger didn't move, didn't flinch. He just let Max take the time he needed. It was then that Max felt the gentle touch, a soft stroke down his neck, the kind of touch that wasn't too much, wasn't too fast. It was a quiet reassurance that seeped into Max's bones, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The stranger's fingers moved slowly over Max's fur, not pulling him in, not demanding anything, just offering simple companionship. Max's body tensed at first, the instinct to pull away still lingering, but as the man continued to stroke his fur gently, Max's shoulders began to relax. His tail, which had been tucked between his legs, began to wag just the slightest bit. The man smiled softly, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, buddy?" Max looked at him, almost as though he could understand. Yes, he had been through a lot. His entire world had changed in ways he could never have predicted. He had lost everything: his home, his family, his place in the world. The man didn't ask for any of those answers. He didn't force Max to speak about it. He simply let him be. Minutes passed in silence, and for the first time in weeks, Max felt his heart beginning to open, just a fraction. He leaned into the man's touch, the warmth of his hand grounding him in a way that Max hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't the same as the love he had known with his family, but it was something. The man's voice broke through the quiet, soft but firm. "I can't promise everything will be perfect, Max, but I can promise you won't have to face the world alone anymore. I'll take care of you, and I'll give you a home." Max's body shuddered with emotion he couldn't quite understand. Home. The word itself felt like a distant memory, something long forgotten. But the warmth in the stranger's words, the promise of companionship, reached deep into Max's heart. The sting of betrayal was still there, still aching, but for the first time in so long, it didn't feel like it was all he had left. The stranger stood up slowly, giving Max space to decide. But Max, for once, didn't hesitate. He walked closer, his steps sure now. He wasn't fully healed, he wasn't whole, but he was ready for something new. The man wasn't a replacement. He was a new beginning. Max allowed himself to trust again, even if just a little. The man's gentle, open hand was a lifeline, pulling him out of the darkness that had threatened to consume him. And in that moment, Max made a choice. He wouldn't face the world alone anymore. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing. It was time to move forward. And with that, Max followed the man, ready to take his first steps into a new life. Max walked through the door of the stranger's home, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the first time in weeks that he had felt a sense of comfort, of security. The air inside was warm, and it smelled of fresh bread and something that resembled the soft, earthy scent of home. An entirely new kind of home, different from the one he had lost. The man, who had yet to introduce himself beyond a simple, "Hey there, boy," stood aside, giving Max the space to enter. It wasn't just the warmth or the food that made this place feel different. It was the kindness. The moment Max stepped inside, his world changed. He was no longer a stray. He was no longer the dog that had been abandoned and left to survive on scraps. "All right, buddy," the man said, crouching down to Max's level. "Let's get you settled in." Max looked up at him, confusion still lingering in his eyes. Who was this man? Why had he stepped into Max's life without hesitation, without asking for anything in return? But there was something about him that made Max feel safe. The way he spoke to Max, the gentle tone, it was as if the stranger knew exactly what Max needed: time, care, and patience. "Let's get you cleaned up, yeah?" the man said, leading Max into a small hallway where the scent of lavender and fresh soap filled the air. Max hesitated for a moment, sniffing at the space, but when the man gestured to a soft bed in the corner, a pile of clean blankets waiting for him, Max felt something inside him snap. A bed, a soft bed. Max's paws were aching, his body tired and ragged from days of wandering, and he could feel the weight of exhaustion in every inch of him. He padded over to the bed, where a soft, fluffy blanket lay, and without thinking, he curled up into it. It was a new feeling, the soft, cozy warmth of a real bed. His body sank into it, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Max felt at peace. The man smiled, watching from the doorway. "You'll be okay now, Max," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The man had given him a new name. Max, the same name he had carried when he was part of a family. But now, it wasn't just a name, it was a second chance. Max looked up at the man who was still standing in the doorway, watching him. There were no harsh demands, no expectations. Just patience. A deep understanding of what Max needed. The kindness he had so desperately craved. The man walked over slowly, sitting down beside Max on the floor. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Max's head. Max stiffened at first, the touch unfamiliar, but it was gentle. His hand didn't pull away. It stayed there, warm and comforting. Max closed his eyes, allowing himself to be held in that moment. The warmth of the man's hand spread through Max's body like a wave, melting away the tension, the confusion, the fear that had been building for so long. This was real. This was different. It was a new beginning. Max felt something stir deep inside him, a desire to trust again, to believe in something. For the first time, he was not an abandoned dog roaming the streets, fighting to survive. He was home. And as much as his heart still ached for the family he had lost, there was something in this man, in this new place that made Max feel like he might belong here too. The man stood up, giving Max a final, reassuring glance. He walked to the kitchen and Max watched him from the bed, still curled up in the warmth. He could hear the sound of a tin can being opened, the rustling of something being prepared. And then, a few moments later, the scent of fresh food filled the air. The man returned with a bowl of food, gently placing it on the ground in front of Max. The rich, savory smell of beef and vegetables made Max's stomach rumble with hunger, but this time, there was no desperation in his hunger. It was the hunger of a dog who knew that, for once, he wasn't alone. He wasn't chasing after scraps anymore. Max eagerly ate, savoring each bite, but his eyes never left the man. He had never felt more grateful, more at peace. The food wasn't just nourishment, it was a symbol of something deeper, a new beginning. The man sat quietly beside him, watching him eat. When Max finished, the man smiled, his face lighting up with warmth. "Good boy," he whispered, giving Max another gentle pat on the head. Max's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the world wasn't so dark. The ache in his chest, though still there, felt a little lighter. The stranger wasn't just offering him food or shelter, he was offering him hope. He was offering him a life that was full of possibility, even after everything Max had been through. But just as Max was about to lay down again, something changed. The man rose from his seat and walked to the door. Max's heart skipped. "Stay here, buddy," the man said, his voice calm. "I'll be right back." Max watched as the man stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. For a brief moment, Max's old fear crept back in. Would he leave like the others? But then he heard the sound of footsteps returning. Soft, steady. The man reappeared in the doorway, holding something in his hand. It was a small, worn-out collar, the same kind of collar Max had worn when he was part of his family. But this one was different. This one had a tag. Max didn't understand at first, but as the man knelt beside him, he clipped the collar gently around his neck, speaking softly the entire time. "Welcome home, Max." Max's heart swelled, and for the first time in forever he knew he had finally found the place he belonged. The pain of the past wasn't gone, but it had lessened, fading into the warmth of the present. He was home now, not because of the collar, but because of the love and care the man had given him. Max, once lost and alone, now had a second chance, and this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood as Max padded alongside the man, now his new owner, through the park. It had become a ritual of sorts, daily walks, quiet moments, and the comforting rhythm of their steps together. Max had found a peace he hadn't thought possible after everything he had been through. The pain of abandonment still lingered in the deepest parts of him, but the warmth of his new life, with its quiet safety and gentle love, was slowly beginning to heal those wounds. It was during one of these walks that Max saw them again. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flash of movement. The familiar figures of Sarah and Tom, standing at the far end of the park near the old oak tree, talking in soft tones. Max stopped dead in his tracks. His heart leapt in his chest, his paws frozen to the ground. It couldn't be. But it was. Max stared, his tail stiff behind him. Sarah was holding the leash of their new puppy, the small dog running around in circles as Tom watched with a smile. It was just like it used to be. The family he had once known, the family he had given his loyalty to, was standing there, right in front of him. But this time, something was different. This time, Max didn't run to them. He couldn't. He had tried. He had believed. He had waited every single day. But in the silence of this moment, as he watched Sarah and Tom, Max felt a strange sense of detachment. The instinct to rush to them, to nuzzle into their arms, was gone. He stood still, watching them with the new clarity he had gained over the past weeks. The ache in his chest, the betrayal he had once felt, still existed, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. The man who had taken him in, who had given him a second chance, was standing beside him, his hand resting gently on Max's back. And as Max looked at his old owners, something unexpected happened. They noticed him. Tom was the first to see Max, his eyes widening in shock. Sarah followed his gaze, and their faces fell. Their smiles faded into expressions of uncertainty, guilt, and, Max could see it clearly now, regret. For the first time since they had abandoned him, Max saw the look on their faces, and it wasn't just confusion. It was regret. They were looking at him the way someone might look at a lost opportunity, a mistake they couldn't undo. Max felt a pang of something, maybe sadness, maybe something else, but most of all, it was clarity. He hadn't run to them because he didn't need them anymore. He had been left behind once, but he was no longer that abandoned dog, alone in the streets. He had found love, care, and a new family. For a long moment, Max stayed where he was, his gaze steady. He didn't bark, he didn't move forward. He just stood still, watching them. And then, without a word, Sarah turned away, her eyes flickering with emotion that she couldn't hide. Tom followed her, the puppy trotting after them, unaware of the silent exchange that had just taken place. Max didn't chase them. He didn't look back. Instead, he looked up at the man who had made him feel safe again, the one who had shown him that he was worthy of love, even after everything. The man bent down, his eyes meeting Max's. He didn't say anything. There was no need. The bond between them had already been formed, stronger than any fleeting moment of the past. They walked away from Sarah and Tom, side by side, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Max's heart, though still scarred, felt lighter than it had in a long time. He had found his place, his new beginning. Max didn't look back. As he and the man continued their walk through the park, the weight of the moment settled in. Max wasn't sure what had changed inside him, but he knew it was significant. That final glance at his old owners, that moment of recognition, was all he needed. They had made their choice. And so had he. Max didn't need to chase after what had already been taken from him. He had been through too much to go back to a life that no longer existed. Some choices can't be undone. The family he had loved had decided to leave him behind, to replace him with another dog, and that was something that couldn't be erased by guilt or regret. Max had given everything to them, and in return, he had been abandoned. But what he hadn't realized was that in that pain, in that betrayal, there was a gift, the ability to choose his own future. Max could have stayed bitter. He could have kept waiting for the family that had hurt him. But instead, he had chosen something better. He had chosen himself. He had chosen the man who had shown him what true kindness and patience looked like. The man who had given him a second chance, a warm bed, and a life worth living. The truth settled deep within Max's chest. Love wasn't something you could force. It wasn't something that could be given to you on demand or taken for granted. It had to be earned. It had to be real. And sometimes love came from the places you least expected. Max had found it, not with Sarah or Tom, but with someone who saw him for who he truly was. A dog who had been through loss, but who was still willing to love. A dog who had learned to trust again, even after the deepest heartbreak. The family had made their decision, and now it was time for Max to make his. His story wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. He looked up at the man, feeling the warmth of his presence once again, and for the first time in a long while, Max smiled. Max stood still for a moment, his paws planted firmly in the grass as he watched his former family walk away, disappearing into the distance. His chest ached, but not with the same intensity it once had. There was no more desperation, no more hope clinging to the thought that they would come back for him. Some choices can't be undone. They had chosen to leave him behind, and in the end, that choice had defined who he was, who he would become. It wasn't just abandonment, it was a pivotal moment that allowed him to realize something important. He didn't need them anymore. For a long time, Max had defined himself by his relationship with Sarah and Tom. He had been the loyal companion, the faithful dog who gave his heart to a family that promised forever. But now, he was more than that. Max didn't feel like the abandoned dog anymore. The hurt was still there, but it didn't define him. The family had made their decision, and so had he. He had made the difficult choice to walk away from the past, to step into a new life, one where he was no longer just a shadow of his former self, haunted by loss. He had found his place. The man beside him, his new owner, had shown Max something that Sarah and Tom had failed to provide: unconditional love. The man didn't just offer food or shelter, he offered Max something far more valuable: a sense of worth, a home, and the kind of bond that only someone willing to truly care could give. In that moment, Max understood. He wasn't just a dog who had been abandoned. He was a dog who had learned, grown, and chosen a future filled with hope. This was where his real story began. Not as the abandoned pet, but as a dog who had found his true home. Max wasn't the same dog anymore. The pain of abandonment still lived in the corners of his heart, but it no longer controlled him. His paws no longer dragged with the weight of sorrow. His tail no longer hung low with defeat. He had found his purpose again, his joy. As he walked alongside his new owner, the man's hand resting gently on his back, Max felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The park they walked through was bright with the golden hues of the setting sun, the world around them full of life, and for the first time, Max saw it clearly. Not as a place that had taken everything from him, but as a place where he had the chance to rebuild. The man slowed his pace, glancing down at Max. "Good boy," he said, and Max couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. They reached the edge of the park, where the road ahead led to their new home, a small house with a porch and a yard. It was his home now. Max turned to look back at the park, at the empty road, at the house where he had once lived, but he didn't feel the need to go back. He had moved on. He had found a new family, a new place where he could truly belong. The door to his past was closed, and the door to his future was wide open. With his head held high, Max trotted beside his new owner, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Max was no longer the abandoned dog waiting for a second chance. He had created his second chance, and now the world was his to explore. Max's journey of transformation is a reminder that no matter what we face, it's never too late for a new beginning. His story shows that even after abandonment, we can find love, hope, and purpose once again. If Max's journey touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of second chances and the power of resilience. And remember, no matter where you've been, it's never too late to find where you truly belong.